Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Akers, and I am the director of the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations here at California State University, San Bernardino. We serve children, parents, and families in the inland region through research, through education, and applied services. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Memorable Messages About Work-Family Conflict. With that, it's my pleasure today to introduce our speakers, Dr. Brian Heisterkamp and Dr. Christina Yoshimura. Dr. Heisterkamp is a professor of communication studies at California State University, San Bernardino. His teaching and research interests focus on interpersonal communication, family communication, and conflict management. Dr. Yoshimura is a professor of communication studies at the University of Montana. She merges her expertise as a licensed mental health counselor with her research in interpersonal and family communication to study interconnections between mental health and relationships. We are so fortunate to have them here today to speak with us and to share their expertise. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Heisterkamp and Dr. Christina Yoshimura.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. And I want to thank Karen, too. She's done a lot of work to help us get this organized for today. So Christina and I have been working together for, I was thinking about this the other day, over 20 years, 22, 23 years. She and I met when we were earning our PhDs at Arizona State. And so we've worked on various projects, different teaching activities. And so today what we want to talk about is some work that we've been doing related to work-family conflict, and in particular, memorable messages. And we'll talk about what that is as we get more into our presentation.
So thanks for having us here today. We are suspecting that most of you know what work-family conflict is, even if you aren't using our particular definition. And we'll talk about it in a really general sense as being that pull we feel between occupational life and family or home life. And when we think about that tension or that pull, we know that there are a lot of words people use to describe it. And so we listed a few here on this slide that come up in research when we are looking at it and when we hear people talking. Some people talk about work-family balance, like it's this thing that we can figure out, right? That we can find some equilibrium or some ideal between our work lives and our home lives. And we don't choose to use that term because we think that's unrealistic for most people. When we think about the stressors that are placed on people by increased occupational expectations like work hours or constant contact through technology with work, having to work more than one job, we see that occupational tension and pressure just going up in our society. And we see that on the family and home life too. We really see that people are being called to intensive parenting expectations, to caring for parents who are happily living longer but are requiring more care and more of our time and roles in their lives longer. And so we think that there's no real balance to be found that's going to be one steady solution. And so we prefer to use these ideas of tension or conflict when we're talking. Because tension sometimes sounds more like it's an internal thing, it's just about me, we really settle on the conflict term because we think that when people experience these pulls between family and between work, they are feeling them within themselves, right? But they're also feeling them between themselves and the people in these two realms. And so for us, we really think about that as work-family conflicts that we experience. And it's understandable that many of us experience this conflict because there are a lot of things that are in conflict. And so one that we note here is that a lot of times the skill sets between work and home are pretty different or require some different prioritization. So there's a lot of variation in the work that people do and their home lives, but often in our occupations, we're required to have some level of objectivity or professionalism or strict focus on a task. And often in our family and our home lives, skills like nurturing or accommodating or focusing on some relational aspects, even if it's still about tasks, is more expected. And so we have to make shifts between what's prioritized or acceptable for us to do in each of those different realms. We also think time is a big issue, and I bet a lot of you feel that too. There are only 24 hours in the day, and both work and family try to lay claim on that time for us. So deciding what amount goes to which realm is its own conflict. And then schedules themselves are difficult to align or make complementary between work and family. Sometimes we're able to juggle things so that we can take one realm in one area of time and another realm in another. But a lot of jobs are between 9 and 5, which coincides with when we can get medical appointments for people or when we need to get kids to activities and other obligations that are all crowding for that same time. finally, there's this strain that we feel in our behaviors and our roles because those realms really aren't separate. So I might feel conflict internally or get in conflict with people because the experiences I have in one area, like getting reprimanded at work or being stressed that I didn't get a task done there, carry over into our home realms. And I might be irritable with my partner or stressed about getting my kid through homework because of those stressors and irritations I experienced in the other realm. What happens in one affects my behaviors and my role in the other realm. So for all of these reasons, we're just normalizing that most people experience some level of work-family conflict if they have home responsibilities and occupational responsibilities.
So as Mark mentioned when he introduced Christina and I, we're both scholars of communication. And so we're interested in the ways that people communicate about work-family conflict. So rather than maybe the cognitions that people have about work-family conflict, we're interested in the ways that they speak about it, communicate about it. And in particular, we're focused on what's referred to as memorable messages. And as you might suspect, memorable messages are messages that people remember. So they tend to be messages that people remember for very long periods of time. And they tend to have an influence on the person's life over a significant period of time. So they can have bearing on the thoughts that we have, the behaviors that we have. And we're interested here, those thoughts and behaviors could be related to work and family. So what are the thoughts that we have about work and family, and how might memorable messages have bearing on that? So the other thing about other scholars who have studied memorable messages is that they can be used to socialize us. So they might socialize family members to family norms or coworkers to norms around an organizational workplace. So people have studied memorable messages in terms of, say, parent-child interactions related to sex and talk about sex and sexuality. They've been studied in terms of dating and racial identity. But our focus here is how might memorable messages be used to look at work and family tension or work and family conflict. And so Christina is going to talk a little bit about some of the data that we collected.
Right, since we think that the ways that people talk about this conflict that we feel really matters to how we act on it and how we are able to engage with others, we wanted to get a large number of participants to really understand those messages. And so we asked people to volunteer to be part of a survey that we did, and we sent information out on different message boards and different online channels. And then we also recruited from some university participants as well. And we ended up with about 1,000 people who were able to complete at least some part of the survey. And we got some information about who these people were in a general demographic sense. And we're not going to go into too much detail, but as you can see here, people range from 18 to 60 years old, with people being an average of around 30 years old. Most were heterosexual in this population, though we did have people who identified as LGBTQ and also who did not choose to identify. We also had about half of the people who fill out the survey, they had children, dependents in the home currently, or they had had children. And then the other half without children, because we thought that might be interesting to look at in terms of the experiences people had with detention in that particular case. And then we found that the three primary ways that people identified who took the survey were as Latinx, which was most of our population, as Caucasian, and as African American.
So we collected this data from the participants. When we collected this, we asked them to tell us what memorable messages they remember delivering to different people. So we asked them, did you have a memorable message to a coworker, to a family member, to a child, to a spouse or significant other? So we collected all of those different memorable messages from our participants. And in this, what we're talking about today are some of the studies that we've done related to the messages to coworkers, and some of the messages that were delivered to family members, and then also some of the messages that fathers delivered. And we came up with this typology, and it's divided on two different continua. So the first is the perceived efficacy or inefficacy of the message that they're sending. So if it was a message that was more efficacious than inefficacious, they conveyed a sense of fulfillment, contentment, satisfaction. The message tended to be more positive, tended to convey a sense of competence in terms of managing that work-family conflict. And then the ineffective messages tended to convey more disappointment in terms of how they were managing that work-life conflict. And then the second continua that we looked at was related to an individual versus shared context. And so the individual messages were where they felt that it was their own behavior that led to their being able to effectively or ineffectively manage work-family conflict. And then the shared messages were those in which either they were receiving contributions from another person, it could be a family member, spouse, child, coworker, or where they felt that they were contributing to another person's success or lack of success in terms of managing work-family conflict. So Christine and I developed these two continua and developed these different ways of conceptualizing or coding sort of themes that we found within each of these four quadrants. And so I just want to highlight a few of, just give you an example of some of the messages that we found in each of these quadrants. And so in this first quadrant where the messages were more effective from an individual perspective, we have a person who said, when I come to work, it's all I think about. And when I go home, I forget all about work. So this is really about an example of someone setting boundaries. So they've said, okay, when I'm at work, I'm focused on work, but when I'm at home, I'm focused on home. Other people might have conveyed some of the other themes that we noticed here, where they prioritize one realm or another. So we frequently found that people would talk about family being more important than work, for example, that family is always going to be with you. Work might come and go, so it's important to prioritize work. That was one of the messages that we heard often that people would say. Or people might talk about that they're getting the hang of this, they're developing their competency, they're understanding how to balance work and family, or how to manage the conflict. Then moving on to the next quadrant where we look at effective shared messages. These were messages where people might be giving advice to another person. And so our view was that if someone is able to give advice to another person, it's sort of indicating that they have competence, or they have the sense that they have competence in managing that conflict. Otherwise, it's not likely that they would be giving advice to another person. So, and they also expressing appreciation to others. So in this message, the person says, we work as a team. I appreciate all the efforts you make to make my workload easier. So that through that appreciation that other people are making contributions to this individual's ability to manage that conflict between work and family sort of indicates that they're efficacious and they're recognizing that they're not doing it alone, that other people are making a contribution to that. Then moving on to the messages that were more ineffective on the individual example. This particular message was about time, and this came up quite frequently for us, that this person said, I feel like there are not enough hours in the day. So they express that they're always running out of time. They don't have enough time for family, don't feel like they're devoting enough time to children, for example, or to a particular task, feeling stress or frustration. Sometimes they would indicate that they feel like they need to give more personal effort, that they sort of recognize a lack in themselves, and that if it was only that they could give more effort to managing this conflict, that they would be able to be more effective in managing it. Many people expressed fatigue, that they were overwhelmed. Some individuals felt disoriented. I will say that many of our participants were, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we had people who had family, work, and school. And so there was really an extraordinary amount of being overwhelmed, that they had all of these three sort of realms that they needed to manage. And so the sense of overwhelmment because of having to manage both work and school and family. And then the last quadrant, ineffective and shared. This is an example of someone who was comparing him or herself to another person. So they said, I don't know how you do it. I'm so tired and all I want to do is sleep. So these people are, right, and one of the reasons why we talked about these as being shared as opposed to individual is that they're sort of reaching out that they do need help. They might be indicating that they are being unfairly treated by others. We found this in the workplace a lot, that maybe a manager or supervisor felt that they were putting too much of a burden on our participants, that if something needed to be done because they were the most affected person in the workplace, that they were always relied upon to work overtime or to do a particular task. And so they felt that they were being unfairly treated in the workplace. And so because of that, they felt that they weren't effectively able to manage that conflict.
So Brian's covered some of the content of the messages. And another thing that we were interested in looking at is, who are you sharing these memorable messages with? If it's the thing I most remember saying, who is that really formative or important message being shared with? And we actually looked at how participants in that survey talked in their coworker relationships, their family member relationships, their relationships with their children, and the relationships with their partner. And so one of the sets of that data we wanted to really get curious about was, how are we talking in our family specifically? And so in terms of the family messages, those memorable messages that got shared with family, we found that people overwhelmingly shared those messages with people who were female identified in their family, and much more often with mothers than anyone else. Almost half of the messages were shared with mother in this set of data. And the second most were sisters. And then fathers and brothers were the next most frequent, but even put together, it wasn't as much as the messages that went to sisters. And so we thought that that was really interesting. That was the case whether the person responding identified as male or female, that the people we're sharing these messages with are predominantly women in our lives. And we really are getting curious about that and looking into that a little bit more. It seems like two different things are happening. One is that we may feel more comfortable going to women because of norms in our society for being able to disclose more to women than men, or women being socialized towards nurturing, and we believe they'll be able to help or be interested, a safe place to talk about this conflict. And that could be one thing that's going on, certainly. Another thing we've noticed, though, is many people, when they told us about these messages, said, I shared this because my mom was asking. I shared this because my mom was challenging what I was doing with work and family. She didn't think I should have stayed up all night working, or she was saying I didn't spend enough time with my kids, so I told her blank. That was the message. And so we think that probably it's a twofold effect, right? We may go to women more often for help or to talk about these things as a safe place, but also women, particularly older women, which is that second part, people disclosed more often to those older than younger than them, and most often to mothers. Then what might be going on there is mothers inserting themselves also into the work-family conflict of their children and asking and pressing. And some of these responses were about setting boundaries or clarifying or working through that. So that's an interesting feature that we were noticing in these messages. A second thing that we did when we were trying to look at different pockets of this data was to look at fathers. And so we were interested certainly in women's experiences. And if you think about where the focus often is in workplace policies or in a lot of research, it's often on mothers. Mothers are expected to work at home and work out in an occupational setting. And how are mothers doing this? And we don't mean to discount that in the slightest. But we're also very curious looking at men today and how they're being socialized and how generational shifts have happened so that men often have more responsibilities in the home and in the lives of family members than the generations before them did. Men may be heading up households in terms of caregiving and in terms of that instrumental task of household life and holding down jobs more than they ever have before. And so we thought, how are fathers positioning themselves? How are they talking about themselves in these messages? So we broke out just the fathers in this part of a study that we did and said, how do they seem to be sharing messages? And so Brian talked about the quadrants. One of the interesting things we found about fathers specifically is they overwhelmingly shared messages about being efficacious and that was an individual thing, that this was something they had achieved and they had accomplished. So I've given you some examples of some of the messages here from fathers. I'm finally able to establish an effective means of time management, and I'm almost completely free of distress. Or said to a child, let me finish what I'm doing and I'll help you, but I can't play till I'm done, right? Like I have this structure, I have this way of managing it. And these messages, when shared, were really in contrast to when we looked at the overall messages. There were many more messages in the larger data set of people feeling overwhelmed, people feeling like they didn't know what to do and being distressed. And so we're interested that fathers often frame themselves as doing okay, as having it covered, even though their ratings on feeling tension were still that they felt that work family conflict. But the way they talked about it was in a way based in competency and based on owning that competency. And that fathers often share these messages to try to teach other people or advise other people. So we looked at that as a dominance move, but only in comparison to submitting, like asking for help from others, which was much more rare for fathers than other people that we were looking at. That fathers often were trying to give advice to other people and say, this is how I've handled it, or to teach kids, especially, how they should handle work and family conflicts. They also shared for affiliation, and this was less often what we saw in the general population of people, which was often venting about how hard it was. When fathers did it, it was more like disclosing. I want you to know what it's like for me. I want to share my story of work and family conflict. And so I'm sharing it to disclose and let you in on that, even though, again, that message is most often that things are going okay and that I've got it handled.
We want to talk now a little bit about how these tensions can be, or excuse me, how this conflict can be managed. So one of the things that we find based on what our participants have told us is to generate family understanding regarding the importance of work responsibilities. So we found instances, particularly when people are talking to their coworkers, that there was a sense that family didn't understand what they did at work or the responsibilities that they had at work. And so communicating that to your family members so they know the important work that you do when you're at work, that's going to help them maybe in terms of you being able to manage that conflict if they're better aware of the strains on your time, the demands that you have, the stresses that you have at work, that sort of thing. If those are communicated to the family, it might help to increase the understanding that your family members have. Then the other thing that we found was related to establishing boundaries or not. So we found that some participants chose to have strict boundaries that when I'm at work, I'm at work. When I'm at home, I don't think about work. That it was, sort of a 9 to 5. Then I don't worry about my family. And then when I'm at home, I just am concerned about my family. And they might do things like not respond to emails or phone calls, that sort of thing, if it's not during their work time. Whereas others found that having that sort of container view of work and family didn't necessarily work. So they might prefer to be more flexible. And so there was one participant who talked about, we don't mind having kids brought into the workplace, that that's just how we are, that we are flexible in terms of having those kind of boundaries. And I think there's something that we're all sort of experiencing now with the COVID shutdown is that, for those who might be working at home, or certainly we've all been affected in some way or another. And so having those boundaries or not can be important in terms of balancing work and family, or managing that work-family conflict. Another thing that we found is that it might be important to seek instrumental support, or sort of tangible support. So this could be help from family or friends, maybe giving your children responsibility if they're old enough to clean the house, to cook a meal, things like that, that kind of ease some of the burden when you're at home. It could be instrumental help from coworkers as well, this could be a way to mentor another coworker if you're asking them to take on some responsibilities that might ease some of your stress and frustration in the workplace. And then, if some people are fortunate to be able to maybe hire instrumental support, someone to come in and clean once a month or something like that, if that's something that's possible for you, that's another way to sort of manage that conflict. And then another thing that we found was to prioritize and organize. And so this really relates to a lot of the messages that we heard about time and being overwhelmed and not having enough hours in the day or enough hours to spend with kids. Or we heard messages, Christina talked about fathers, and we heard messages some messages of regret from fathers, that they felt that they were spending too much time at work and not enough time with the kids, and that the kids were getting old and they weren't able to, take them to a baseball game or soccer game or whatever the case might be. So to be able to prioritize those and then organize. And so some of this can take overlap with in terms of establishing boundaries. So being able to say no, for example, that's not a priority for me right now. And so I'm just going to say no. It's not a goal that I have. So that you can better able manage that conflict.
We also found that just communicating about that conflict was really cathartic for people. A lot of people really noticed venting as a specific thing they did, so that they would say, I was ready to quit my job, but just talking to my coworker and hearing that he'd been through it too really helped. Or, talking to my mom about how I'm never going to be able to manage all of these things. And she said, I've been there. That's been there for me too. That kind of venting led to some understanding that this was a more universal, it kind of normalized. And so that venting in terms of sharing experiences can be helpful for people. We would add a cautionary note in the next one, though, about perspective taking. How are you sharing your perspective of work and family conflict in terms of how you vent? And so sometimes certainly it's going to be negative that things are hard. And yet if we always only share messages of how hard things are, that can lead other people to thinking we're not very competent and likable, and can also make us not feel that great about how we're managing the tension. So absolutely being honest about how hard things are and seeking that validation and support is great. And also some people noted having messages where they really kind of tried to take some perspective, like, it's really hard, but I know it's worth it. I have this great family and I'm glad I can support them, right? That I have both parts of this world and that I am lucky to have that, even if it's stressful at times. So being able to sometimes reframe how we're seeing it and looking at the opportunities involved in managing two really rich areas of life is something that can be helpful for us as a communicative move we can make. A third thing here is giving support or advice to others. Again, I was giving you some examples of people who really, they felt efficacious and they wanted to share that this is how they'd done it or what they prioritized. And that seemed to give them increased feelings of competency and may really give some new ideas to people who are struggling with being new to some of those challenges or changes in their work-family conflict. Again, just a cautionary note to recognize that when I was talking about the family members and the members who pushed on those boundaries or were giving advice to people on how to do it, many people did push back and say, I'm doing it my way, or this is my life, or here's how I want to manage this work and family conflict. And so when we're giving advice or support, it's probably best if that's in hand with someone having asked for that. Someone asking, I don't know how you do it. What are you doing? Do you have any ideas? And then offering that advice and support. And then we just want to leave on the fact that this is really not an individual issue, that we can suggest people do things in the ways they communicate and how families and others manage work and family conflict. But we want to really be aware that there are larger system structures at play here in terms of setting up the expectations and the hours and schedules of work and perpetuating ideas of intensive parenting that can really lead people to feel overwhelmed and at the end of their rope in terms of how to cope. And that while individual messages absolutely and should change to be able to seek support and get some change, we also think the heft and the weight of organizational messages, governmental messages, or businesses, or religious organizations, larger systems speaking out about how to support and how to change the expectations that we place on people so that there is more room psychologically and time-wise to be able to manage work and family is also an important set of messages to look at.
So I know Mark is going to
I'm coming back.
facilitate questions, and I'll just leave this so that these are ways that people can get in touch with ICDFR.
I appreciate that. Yes, thank you. Thank you both for sharing your expertise on what is, no doubt a topic that's on everybody's mind, right? It's in the forefront of our lives now, probably more than ever, right? And that says a lot because managing work and family and life is always a big challenge. As a fellow work family researcher, only from the psychological perspective, not from the communication perspective, this stuff was fascinating, right? I really appreciate what you shared because, and I promise I'll turn it over to the audience in a moment. But what I kept thinking about was, as I think about these things from a psychological perspective, and you mentioned like sort of how do we think about these things and the underlying sort of experiences and cognitions that explain our experience of work family conflict. But what that looks like from a communication perspective, from the messages we share, from the types of things we say, and what that means, fascinating. When I won't be boring other people, I want to talk to you more about this stuff because it's really great. But let me. We do have a number of questions from folks that I'd like to just share with you, and please feel free to kind of speak as you would like about them. One of the questions that was asked, and I'm going to ask this one first because it's kind of more general about the process of what you do and how you studied work-family conflict. And the person asks, in what ways are memorable messages kind of describing what people are experiencing in the moment, and in what ways are they helpful for identifying strategies for dealing with work-family?
Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry, Brian. Do you want to go?
Well, I'm sure we both have something to say about it. I think the thing is that, we were asking participants to recall these messages, and so we don't know, we did not ask them when this message was delivered, right? But what other researchers have found in terms of memorable messages is that while they might not recall the exact wording that was used in the message, sort of the impact that those messages have on what it was talking about in terms of socializing in the work and family realms does have a more lasting effect. And so if, particularly there have been quite a few studies looking at these in terms of sex and sexuality. And so if you have, like Christine was talking about mothers, if your mother is talking to you about sexuality and there's a message that she's conveyed about, whatever that family norm might be, you might not recall exactly what she said, but it has a lasting effect in terms of the values that you have around sex and sexuality. And I know Christina has done other work on memorable messages as well, so I know she'll have something else to say.
Yeah, I would just say from a psychological or even neuroscientific approach, it matters less that this was actually the message that they shared and more that this is what they remember, because that memory of the message is what's shaping their cognitive constructs, like the way they're thinking about work and family, the way they think about themselves. It tells us something about how they see work-family tension. If it's a negative message that they're recalling, that's pretty salient, that's pretty important to them, and that's one of the views that's being constructed for them, if that's the message they've held on to most strongly. And similarly, if it's a positive one of success, that tells us something. So I think that those are ways we've looked at it as being telling of how people are associating messages and that experiences of work-family conflict, even though I don't know if this is what the questioner is thinking, we weren't there, we didn't hear
Right.
them say these things, but we still think it's really telling. And we did do some tests where we were trying to associate, and we're going to do more of these where we look at, is there any connection statistically between remembering these really certain types of messages, maybe the more efficacious and individual ones, and the level of work-family tension or work-family conflict that people felt, because we did measure how high is this. And a lot of people had some pretty high work-family conflict in this when they were answering. And so we want to say, was there anything about these messages that helps us to associate or understand? I didn't speak about it earlier. I was really trying to be conscious of staying in our 30 minutes, and we went over by 2. So I was down on myself for my workplace success. But I did want to note that for the fathers specifically, one of the tests we have run so far is looking at whether age was a factor. It turned out presence of kids or sexual orientation or racial ethnic background, none of those mattered in terms of work-family tension, but what did matter was age. That younger fathers said they experienced more work-family conflict than older fathers did. And so it didn't seem to matter so far on the messages that they were sharing, but we thought that that was pretty interesting that the younger fathers are experiencing that more, and kind of goes with our hypothesis of these expectations are changing for people in terms of what they're supposed to be doing in this. Conflict is probably higher for generations that are expected to really hold down some significant occupation, maybe several jobs, and also be doing this household family work.
Right. Yeah, sure. Changing gender norms. And I'd imagine life stage too, right? To some extent, probably matters there as well.
Sure.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's great stuff. There are a couple of questions about gender and parents I'll get to in a moment. One thing though that kind of follows from some of the things that you've said, because you're talking about what's memorable and the way we think about things. Somebody asked, what does it mean and again, I don't think this was specific from your study, but I think your expertise will bring, will bear on it. What does it mean to the extent that the things that we say are different than the things that we do when it comes to managing work and family?
Boy, I think
Easy
that's
questions.
a good point to bring up, right? Like, it's like my aspirational self. This is what I'm holding on to as being maybe the most in some cases, although certainly a lot of the messages were disparaging or overwhelmed, and it didn't seem like people were doing too much of what we usually look at in research as social desirability, like answering what I think the right answer is and what I'm supposed to say. I wouldn't say that was overwhelmingly what we saw happen, because a lot of people expressed significant distress. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think the way we're speaking and what we remember really matters, even irrelevant to our other actions. But I would strongly suspect it's very connected to our actual actions. Brian?
Yeah, no, I'm part of what I'm thinking too is if we could take a look at some of the messages that people sent to coworkers versus supervisors. So people were much more likely to send these sort of messages of distress, being overwhelmed, being treated unfairly to coworkers, and much less likely to do that sort of messaging to a supervisor.
Yeah.
So, they might be thinking how unfairly you're treating me, but they're saying it to their coworker as opposed to their supervisor.
Interesting. Right. That makes a lot of sense. I imagine you might predict similar differences maybe in how we talk to our spouse or partner about responsibilities and demands at home. I'm a little giddy. This is fun stuff. This is really interesting to think about. One person asked about cultural differences, and I'm not sure if you looked at them or if you just have thoughts, but the question essentially is, are there cultural differences in how individuals talk about their work and family experiences?
We just ran this data, didn't we, Christina?
We really sincerely expected that there would be. Like, we thought that might be the case. And we had tried hard not to have a primarily Caucasian population, because that's often the case in a lot of published research. And we thought, okay, we have really, done this legwork, and we think we have some good perspectives that we can compare. And we thought that would play out as having more of a difference in level of work-family tension or the kinds of messages. And so far, it hasn't been a significant predictor of any of these things, including who we spoke with, which I thought perhaps some of that would bear out. Like, maybe more extended family members would be connected with, and maybe some cultures that have more communal aspects, but that so far has not panned out. It was your immediate family still seemed to be what was the case overwhelmingly, no matter what background. So not yet, although we will keep looking at this data in some different ways. There are a lot of different ways to look at it. And I think that's a really important thing to bring up and to look for.
Another question, similar but different, I suppose, is the person asks, do fathers and mothers communicate differently, or communicate different messages around the work-family conflict?
I think, Christina talked about this, and we've looked more specifically at fathers. Now, we haven't looked at the mother's messages yet. But I think, as Christina mentioned, it was interesting to us that, particularly when they were talking to their children, there were much more messaging related to being efficacious and dominance that, and I think that comes to some of the norms around fathering and maleness in our culture, that there's sort of this expectation that, I'm in charge here. If there's a problem, we had a few messages where fathers, explicitly said that this is my responsibility. I'm the one that needs to take care of this, sort of brushing off any other means of support that was potentially being offered. We don't know for sure if it was being offered, but the messages sort of came across as, I've got this, it's my responsibility. And I think,
I'm really excited to look at the motherhood data specifically, because it's been based on, sort of different projects that we have worked out so far. But the comparison I was making between fathers and the overwhelming dominance of those messages and efficacious nature of those messages was in comparison to our general population, which was about 2/3 female and 1/3 male. So it was skewed more towards the female in terms of what the overall pattern was, but we don't have that specific data yet either.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, and it's an important question to look at, right? Because the domains of work and family are sort of by their nature gendered. And so the experiences that men and women have, or fathers and mothers have, in the family domain versus the work domain are likely different, right? They're likely going to be different, and understanding that seems pretty important.
Yeah. And, the other thing is that we'd like to take a look at single parented households to see, what effect that has. And unfortunately, in this population, or in this sample, we didn't have any same-sex couples. So, what sort of differences might there be in terms of the messages that are conveyed about that, in terms of the boundaries of work-family conflict?
A couple of folks asked about tips for messaging or tips for communication. Specifically, one person was asking about partner, spouse, another one was children. So maybe you can kind of talk about it together. But do you have thoughts, or are there messages that you learned from your data or from your research in general that, sort of like guidelines for communicating with your partner, spouse, and children about the work-family interface?
I think we could certainly pair our data with other things that we know. John Gottman does some great work on looking at how we can have these kinds of conversations about conflict with people. And I think that that's a good one if we're looking at partner relationships and we're talking about work-family conflict, that we can try not to be defensive when our partner brings something up, and that we can try to engage in some openness to that conversation, even though other research on household tasks will tell you everyone in the household thinks they're doing the most. So you might think it would work to point out that your partner is not carrying their share of the load, and that will surely be persuasive and ease your burden of work-family conflict. And that will almost never happen. I will just say, I will try not to be completely certain with you, but it won't be a good way to go, because your partner, even if some objective person could come in and say they're doing less, they're not going to feel like it. And even if they do, they're going to probably feel badly or self-conscious about it. So pointing that out in quite that way is unlikely to work well. But John Gottman talks about softening your startup, like saying, I really appreciate all the things you do around the house. I know I probably wouldn't get as much done without you. I'm wondering if these two other things were anything we might be able to share or you could add on, right? That kind of soft startup, acknowledging some positive aspects of what's going on, and then trying to ask for some change would be one suggestion I would make for partners.
Yeah, and I was thinking one of the things that I mentioned was, we had several participants who said that they felt that their family didn't understand their work responsibilities. And so, part of that's the onus is on you, that if they don't understand, maybe you haven't communicated that to them. So talking about work, talking about, the tasks that you have at work, the deadlines that you have at work, the people that you work with, that sort of thing, so that they have a better understanding of what you do, when you do go to work. And, I think even now, like for people who might be working from home, to be able to communicate that there are boundaries, that if I'm at my desk and it's the work hours and I'm typing on my keyboard, that means I'm doing work. And so please don't come in and, disturb me while I'm doing it. Like, I had to put a do not disturb sign on my door today so that my family didn't come in here. Those sorts of things, like communicating it to people so that they know this is what's going on in my life.
And maybe with some good framing and perspective taking, like we said, because like Brian, I'm struggling with this at home. And my kids did say to me the other day, you and Dad are only ever mad about work. You're only ever talking about how bad everything is. And we're just sick of hearing it. And I was like, oh, I'm probably giving them the worst sense of what can happen in your work life. And, thinking about, so my partner and I did talk afterwards about what are we going to share tonight? We're going to have a different plan. And we talked about, I had this great student today who emailed me, or, trying to emphasize some of the things that are going well in work-family conflict, or I was so glad to get done early today because I got to spend more time with you, matters in terms of how they're going to see things, because they are picking up. My kids are 13, but I think at every age, they've probably been able to pick up, kinds of the messages I'm sending there about how important they are, how I view family, how I view work life, by the kinds of messages, and that thinking about our tone and what we choose to share, so that there's some level of our actual perceptions there, not to make it seem better than it is, but there is good stuff going on even when we have conflict and tension.
No, that's great stuff. I love your point too about the intentionality, right? Like being intentional about making sure those positive messages are also being shared. Yeah, it's interesting. I do think not for everybody, obviously, but for many people who found whose work changed to being home, right? And particularly in professional populations where, folks sort of during COVID have transitioned into that. That's a whole new window for messaging, right? That's a whole new window for communicating that members of the family are now exposed to that they would not have been exposed to in the past.
And, and being able to set boundaries yourself, because if you used to be able to set geographic boundaries, that when I was at work, that's what I did. But now, you're home, you could work 12, 15 hours a day, but being able to set boundaries so you make time for family too.
You'll someday have to share how we do that, because that one's a tough one.
Right, it is, yeah.
There's actually a question to this point. I'm not sure if you have thoughts on it, but somebody else asked, are there resources available or advice on how to communicate with your supervisor about setting healthy work and workload boundaries?
Resources available.
Or guidance.
Resources, I'm not sure, but I think some of the same thing that we talk about in terms of being intentional with our messages to our family is the same thing we can do with our coworkers and supervisors. That that these what are my responsibilities, and maybe I feel like I'm being overwhelmed, that things are being put on me, because we heard this quite a bit, that because competence sometimes is not rewarded. So because you're so competent at something, you're being asked to do it more and more and more. And so maybe that's an opportunity, say, for you to mentor somebody else in the workplace. Because I'm competent at this, maybe I can help train somebody else to do this as well. I think that's part of the advice that I would have in terms of approaching a supervisor or manager in the workplace.
I think that's a great idea. I also think that's one of the positive outcomes that can come from venting or disclosing more with people from different workplaces is you can follow up with, is there anything at your workplace that's going well? Like, is there anything that is a policy there that you can think about introducing in your own workplace by bringing it up in a suggestion box or in an email, or in, again, that non-defensive, non-confrontational way of, I love working here. It might help me even more to get a lot out of my day here if we could try X or Y. And sometimes we just don't know what those ideas are without talking to other people.
That's a great point. Well, those are the questions that we have. So we can wrap up here. I want to thank you both for all that you shared, for taking time to meet with us and share your expertise. My sincere thanks as well, of course, to all of you who joined us and participated in today's webinar hosted by the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations at California State University, San Bernardino. At the ICDFR, we've been providing guidance for parents and families based on science and best practice since 2002. If you'd like to hear more from us, please like us and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. You can also learn more about ICDFR projects by visiting our webpage on the CSUSB website. That's csusb.edu/ICDFR. So with that, again, my thanks to our speakers. My thanks to all of you who joined us today. Have a wonderful day and be well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having us.